Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, and I wish to introduce you to the Warhammer 40k universe. Now, let us continue with our tale of the Ynnari in Blood of the Phoenix. Blood of the Phoenix tells the story of an ancient enmity between the Asuryani and their Drukhari cousins. It is played out as a vicious star-crossing hunt, a crux point in history that could define the hopes and fates of the Eldari race as they adapt to a galaxy of flame. Jain Zar and his mercenary Drukhari force have been sent out into the stars by the shadowy overlord of Kormorah, Asdrubal Vect. Their task is to assassinate Yvraine, the leader of a swiftly rising cult, so audacious it has even inspired the legendary Phoenix Lord Jain Zar to fight in its defense. The spread of this cult has caused shockwaves of cause and effect across the galaxy. Some believe it is tied to the formation of the Great Rift itself, and that it must be stopped at all costs. Others believe the cult of the Ynnari is key to the eventual defeat of the Eldari's mortal enemy, Slaanesh. A seer's prophecy has foretold of Jain Zar's assassination attempt, and word of it has reached Jain Zar's ears. Gathering her allies from Craftworld's Saim-Hann, she resolves to launch a preemptive strike against the Drukhari hunting Yvraine, killing them all before they can fulfill their deadly contract. The stage is set for a dreaded act of kin strife and a duel between champions of the blade that will resonate throughout history. The time of death sentient. To quote, "The Eldari had found a precarious new hope amidst the twilight years of their race, something that could potentially prevent their ancestral nemesis from consuming them, and maybe even stave off their doom altogether. The Eldari had witnessed tumultuous times at the tail end of the 41st millennium. Being a race blessed with psychic abilities, and in some cases genuine precognitive power, the promise of cataclysm did not go unheralded. As ever, the Eldari sought to turn the twists of fate to their own ends. The High Farseer Eldrad Ulthran of Craftworld Ulthwé, more than any other. Over the last few hundred years of his immense lifespan, Ulthran had detected a confluence of soul energy whenever he had cast his mind into the afterlife of the Infinity Circuit. The lingering essences of the dead were blending together into a slow but discernible heartbeat, like that of some impossibly huge giant slumbering in the endless depths of the Eldari soul. It was the nascent essence of a god of the dead, Ynnari. In that great potentiality, Eldrad Ulthran saw hope. It was the Pathfinders of Alatok, led by Illic Nightspear. Shortly after the nature of that moon became clear, Eldred set in motion a cascade of events that would shape the galaxy. The High Farseer projected his consciousness across the galaxy, enlisting the aid of a Harlequin mask from the Midnight Sorrow. Led by the enigmatic figure known as Inriam's Spectre, they were foremost amongst those Eldari who believed that chaos could be defeated and that Ynnari could one day help their race transcend their ancient doom. Together, the High Farseer and his Harlequin allies enacted a great ritual that saw a crystal conduit established between the Eldari craftworlds and the psychically resonant sands of Coheria. His plan was nothing less than to channel the foremost souls of the Eldari Infinity Circuits into the same place at the same time, in doing so awakening Ynnari long before the natural point of his culmination. This was an act fraught with peril, for it would plunge all of the craftworlds into darkness, and feasibly lead to their spiritual destruction. Yet it also held the potential to see the Eldari race, living and dead, united for one glorious moment that could see Slaanesh slain forever. In Eldrad's eyes, it was worth the gamble. The consequences of that great risk were profound. Coheria was under Imperial control, though it was considered minor and near worthless compared to the planet it orbited, Port Demesnes. The Eldari assault upon Demesnes, orchestrated by Eldred as a distraction to draw attention from his true agenda, summoned an Imperial response. Predictably, the Imperium marshaled every asset it could spare from the system to rush to the defense of its primary holdings, but there was one whose hunter's instincts was strong enough to detect the feint. Watch Captain Artemis of the Death Watch, a specialist in the arts of Xenos hunting, took his kill team to Coheria, and there engaged Eldred Orthrin at the critical point of his grand ritual. Just as the moon's sands were thrumming with the psychic energy of countless Eldari spirits, blood was spilt on both sides, and Eldred's Harlequin allies cut down. When Inriam's Spectre, held at gunpoint, asked Artemis whether he could put aside his hatred in order to deal a death blow to a far greater mutual foe, the Chaos God Slaanesh, the answer was a bolt to the head. The ritual, so close to completion, went haywire. The psychic emanations intended to awaken Ynyad echoed out into the void, but they were unfocused, for Eldred had been forced to fight for his life against the Death Watch in order to escape Coheria at all. The great gamble had failed, but for one aspect, a tiny mote of consciousness that arced through space, eventually coming to land within the dark city of Cormorah, in the arena known as the Crucible. A grand clash was occurring between the famed Lilith Hesperax and the aspiring succubus Yvraine. The dance of blades continued for long minutes, to the rapt glee of the crowd around them, but Yvraine was sorely wounded and her strength was waning. In a moment of desperation, Yvraine launched herself at her opponent and seized her in a suffocating grip, but she could feel her own life force fading. It was as she passed the threshold of mortality that the mote of consciousness sent from Coheria, now burning bright as a meteor, blazed into her. Perhaps it was because she was at that instant beyond the boundary of death that she attracted Ynyad's gaze. Perhaps it was because she had walked so many paths, thereby living a life reminiscent of the lost ancestors of her race. Whatever the reason, the experience of becoming God-touched was transcendental. Though it granted her only a sliver of the nascent deity's deathly potential, Yvraine held more power in that moment than any other Eldari alive. She had become the first and most potent of the Ynnari. Yvraine's transformation was a boulder hurled into a stagnant pond. The destructive ripples caused the metaphysical quake of a warped disjunction, and during the resultant demonic invasion, she escaped. Her flight through the webway led her to Exodite worlds, several Eldari craft worlds, and even a Crone world in the Eye of Terror, and in each location, she left dissent and schism in her wake. Nowhere was the effect of her action more clear than on craft world Bialtan, where she raised a new manner of being, the Avatar of Ynyad, known to the Azunyani as the Incarn. To some Eldari, Yvraine was a herald of disaster. Asdrubal Vect's agents were sent to end her disruption for good, headed by Drasar, the Master of Blades. But to others, she represented hope, and thousands of Eldari joined the cause of the Ynnari, amongst them the Phoenix Lord, Jain Zar. The Eldari of the craft worlds walk a narrow path, applying themselves to single specialities to avoid the wanton indulgence that doomed their once great empire. Those who study the art of war are skillful and swift, their supernatural levels of focus making them among the deadliest fighters in the galaxy. The Azuyani, as the craft worlders call themselves, have stared into the abyss of their own extinction for long millennia. They survive, nonetheless. While many of them might wish to avoid all conflict and slowly rebuild their strength away from the lesser races, in a galaxy riven with terrors, they have no option but to fight with every weapon at their disposal. Yvraine's seismic revelations upon Bialtan led to the birth of the deathly avatar of Ynyad, known as the Incarn. The subsequent shattering of the craftworld's infinity circuit caused a great explosion of psychic force that rippled through the Eldari race. That act inflicted nightmares beyond measure, contributed to the opening of the Great Rift, and brought strife on a scale unseen since the fall. But all was not ill, for those Eldari with the mental fortitude to ride out the shockwave turned the shifting psychic landscape to their advantage. Now, the seers and mystics of the Eldar race find their powers enhanced to a dangerous degree. Their leaders speak with fierce, compelling passion, and the most talented combatants can attune their psyches into the lethal arts they practice so feverishly, allowing them to achieve truly incredible feats of arms. The warriors that walked at Yvrain's side in this new era, and had the privilege of fighting alongside Jain Zar, were many and varied. Among them were resplendent Ynnari from the wild hosts of Saim-Hann. Hailing from a craft world that clung to tribal traditions of yore, they were called barbaric by some, easily intoxicated by the spilling of blood and the thrilling sensations of war waged at breakneck speed. Yet swiftness is a virtue, as the Eldari learned long ago from the avian god Falshu, the same mythical creature that lent the Falcon antigrav tank its name. A common tactic is for a squad of aspect warriors mounted in such a vehicle to descend from the clouds as a raptor dives upon its prey, often escorted by the nimble jetbikes known as Vipers. As the Falcon and Vipers lay down a hail of supporting fire, the warriors leap out to change the course of battle in a storm of blades. The howling banshee aspect wolf let fly a terrifying war scream as they do so, their psychosonic amplifiers turning the battle cry into a crippling neural barrage that induces momentary paralysis. It is in this critical moment that the howling banshees dive in for the kill, powered blades flashing and shuriken pistols spitting out streams of razored monomolecular discs. Jain Zar, the Storm of Silence. The Phoenix Lord, known to the Eldari as Jain Zar, is one of the original aspect warriors, taught by Azumen to embody a particular aspect of the Eldari war god, Cain. The endless fury of the bloody-handed god is epitomized by Jain Zar, and by extension, the howling banshees that are her spiritual sons and daughters. She wears a stylized incarnation of the female bodysuit and flowing mane that is an iconic part of howling banshee war gear, and wields powered weapons that whirl around her as she leaps, slashes, and pirouettes through the ranks of the foe. The lightweight but deadly polearm known as the Blade of Destruction, and the triple-pronged throwing weapon, the Silent Death. Her enemies, rendered witless and stunned by her mind-shattering war shout, are cut down like reed stalks in a hurricane. To have such a legendary warrior as an ally is to be all but certain of victory, though in siding with the Ynnari, Jain Zar was to finally meet her match. The Drukhari, the dark city of Khormara, held in uneasy balance by an invisible web of power structures and alliances, was hurled from carefully moderated tyranny into a maelstrom of anarchy by the Ynnari. Asdrubal Vect was forced to withdraw to safety, and from there sought to orchestrate his revenge. To say the Drukhari are descended from the Eldari of the Fall is both true and falsehood. Some of the eldest actually harken back from that cataclysmic time. In many ways they were responsible for it. These unrepentant fiends are powerful beyond measure, able to make plans of conquest that span eons, and seeing them through to their grisly conclusions. Their denouement all the more satisfying for long anticipation and cold revenge. Most dangerous of all is Asdrubal Vect, whose vision of a dark meritocracy remade Khormara 6 millennia ago, and who has kept a stranglehold on the Dark City ever since. Only the elevation of Yvrain and the stirring of Ynnari has truly challenged his control, for it has shaken a dark city on a spiritual level, as well as unleashing a physical cataclysm. It was the disruption of his carefully maintained status quo that earned the Ynnari Vect's undying enmity. He was not free to respond as he would wish, for in his self-imposed exile, Vect had faked his own death in order to draw out his enemies in rival cabals, and any overt action would betray his survival. Instead, he employed those warriors that stood outside the framework of the Archon's direct control. The force that was sent to enact Vect's punishment on Yvraine was formed of mercenary elements. The core was a shrine of incubi, lethal masters of the powered clave blade, every bit as skilled in the arts of war as their aspect warrior cousins. Their leader was Drazar, the master of blades, who had killed his way to rulership over the great shrine of the incubi. The warriors that fought alongside him whispered that Drazar had been on Yvraine's trail even before Vect's summons had arrived via Scourge messenger. Drazar's intense skill and patience were put toward hunting the Ynnari, and only the most gifted Eldari could hope to stop him. The disparate elements who formed Drazar's force were drawn from the fringes of Drukhari society. Amongst them were the Hellions known as the Soaring Blades, who were formerly disbanded years before, but continued to operate as one of Vect's many groups of agents, and the gun skimmer venom crewed by their allies in the witch cult of Strife. Closer still to the incubi of the Great Shrine were the scourges that act as messengers between Vect and Drazar, winged Drukhari that are expert scouts and snipers. Drazar, Master of Blades. The mercenaries that Vect called into his service were bound under his vows of silence. These vows were irrelevant to the Incubus Supreme, Drazar, known as the Master of Blades, for he never spoke, nor betrayed any mortal feeling more than merely acknowledging worthy foes with a single incline of his head. Drazar is the executioner of his order, teaching only with his blades. Those who challenge him for leadership of Cormorar's principal shrine learn a brief and fatal lesson. Ultimately, Drazar is an incubus, and hence can be hired as an assassin if the price is right. Only one such as Vect can hope to command his loyalty for long, for Drazar's price is steep indeed. There are those who whisper that he kneels at an iron statue of Cain each dawn, that he survives on nothing but the taste of victory, even that he was once the Phoenix Lord Ahra, father of scorpions, who burned with the dark light of chaos. The truth is known only by a few, though it is likely that Jain Zar is amongst them. Even she will not speak what she knows. Craft World Saim-Hann is one of the largest craft worlds in the galaxy, with biodomes so immense they contain windswept fields and prairies as well as forests, spires and gardens of contemplation. It was there that Drazar first struck at Yvraine and her Ynnari, only to find other forces already watching over her. It was upon the extensive and beautiful plainscapes of Craftworld Saim-Hann that the Ynnari were to learn of the deadly force hunting them down. There Yvraine and the Vizark were preaching the new truths of the Death God to a gathering of autarchs, the clan chieftains of Saim-Hann's proud warrior tribes. Though seen as barbarous by some of their fellow Azuyani for their traditions of blood rites and ritual combat, the inhabitants of Saim-Hann were fierce exponents of the Craftworld way of life, and would fight with everything they had to see their race thrive once more. Faces lit by the roaring bonfire of the speaking place, the tribal chieftains listening to what Yvraine had to say. Though the most traditional of their number shied away from the radical solution she presented, speaking passionately against it, some remained quiet, narrowing their eyes and thinking hard about her proposals. There was a path to that Craftworld's sacred place that Drazar had learned of long before, and he remembered it well. Intending to slay Yvraine and deal a crippling blow to his hated Craftworlder cousins at a single stroke, his strike force appeared out of the gloom to attack even as the autarchs sat spellbound by Yvraine's tale. The night sky above the Saim-Hann prairie shimmered violet and split as a webway portal opened for the first time in 9,000 years. Though Jain Zar knew of its existence, even the Saim-Hann craftworkers had forgotten the fact that above this sacred place lay a gate into the webway. The first outward signs of the Drukhari presence came in the form of a blizzard of toxin splinters launched by the mercenary Hellions and Scourges that had burst out from the webway portal. The volleys were aimed at the unprotected faces of the autarchs. 3 of the noble craftworkers went down, clawing at their tortured flesh. The fusillade was followed a split second later by a barrage of negative emotion, as if a tidal wave of despair had crashed across those souls who had attuned their feelings to Yvain's tale a few moments before. The incubi had triggered their tormentors, arcane weapons made from shattered spirit stones, to great effect. Suddenly, Jain Zar was among the reeling Eldari, dropping from a speeding venom transport with the grace of a Felid. Even before he had landed, his blade lashed out to take Yvain's head from her neck. Were it not for the lightning-fast reactions of the Vizak, the High Priestess of Ynnari would have been slain in that moment. But as Jain Zar's blade came down hard, the sword of silent screams lanced out, taking the blow upon its crystal length. Jain Zar's fell clave split in 2 swords, as it was designed to do, and he whipped them around in a figure of 8. Yvain was no longer there. Flipping back to handspring like an acrobat over the edge of the bonfire, and twisting in mid-air as she did so, she landed with feet planted and her arcane blade drawn. The battle that ensued was as breathtaking a display of skill and speed as any gladiatorial spectacle in the arenas of the Dark City. Jain Zar did not fight alone, for his elite incubi brothers and sisters from the Great Shrine fought alongside him. Each one was met by an autarch, as the chieftains of Saim-Hann darted in, and the battle became a dozen duels at once, almost stylized in their blademanship. The living myths of one Eldari culture were matched in opposition to those of the other, seeming as shadows dancing against a flickering firelight. With a kinsman bodyguard of the Saim-Hann commanders joined the fray, they were met by cackling Hellions and swooping Scourges, who darted down from the cloud of violet light high above, their guns spitting poison and elegant blades flashing bright. For a while, that firelit duel was balanced on a nice edge. Then Jain Zar took the head of an autarch with one blade, even as he blocked Yvain's crown sword with the other. A flip, a pivot, a kick, and a second chieftain was sent staggering onto the blade of a waiting incubus. The delicate balance was disrupted, and the duels, hard fought, but with no clear victor, descended into a series of clinical kills. Yvain found herself hard-pressed, 3 incubi closing in on the Vizak even as Jain Zar's flashing blades kept her fighting for her life. The portal high above blazed bright, and a deafening, mind-numbing shriek tore the air. This time it was Drukhari as well as craftworkers and Ynnari that reeled. Their senses overloaded to the point that the scream became their whole world. A flash, then another, then 3 more. Each arc of the blade followed by the spinning, decapitated head of an elite incubus or speeding Hellion. Rich Eldari blood flew in spirals and spattering sheets, hissing where it landed in the fire. Jain Zar had arrived, and she fought with sudden and deadly surety. She was the tempest that reaps. The Drukhari were as wheat before her scything blade. Within moments, the bright red hues of the Saim-Hann craftworkers were joined by the bone of a dozen howling banshees. They gave vent to a piercing, nerve-shredding scream, and the Drukhari reeled, stunned for a critical moment. Hellions, cut from the skies by those banshees making acrobatic leaps, toppled into the flames. The smell of roasting flesh and burning hair grew thick. Jain Zar, on the verge of cutting down another Saim-Hann autarch, narrowly avoided being decapitated by a banshee's blade. He cast an appraising glance around the battlefield, and in that moment saw that he was outnumbered and outmatched. Bringing his demiglaves together twice as a signal, he and his incubi changed to a defensive fighting style in an instant. Drazar's venom transport hurtled down from the purplish miasma above the battle, and one after another the incubi vaulted atop it, clinging onto its fuselage, with Drazar leaping up to crouch at its fore. The venom sped across the prairie, hellions and scourges peeling off in its wake. The Saim-Hann Eldari quickly restored order, sending word for their spirits' ears to gather the spirit stones of the fallen. Autarch Kerendil summoned a falcon grav tank to her side. As Jain Zar and her surviving howling banshees joined Kerendil in the passenger hold, an escort of clan kinsmen moved to reinforce them. Leaping into the saddles of their Windrider jet bikes and moving swiftly into position alongside the falcon. Together the ad hoc formation sped off after the venom that had carried Drazar away, a blood hunt desperate to find and slay a lethal quarry. A running battle ripped across Saim-Hann's prairie as the craft worlder's local star sank behind the horizon. It was so fast and hard fought that even a single eye blink of lapsed concentration meant sudden and violent death. Hellions looping erratically through heavy weapons volleys from the Falcon and flying backwards on their skyboards to return fire sent streams of splinter ammunition not at the grav tanks, but at the jet bike riders that hurtled behind them. Scourges winged and span in close pursuit, climbing high to let their pursuers pass beneath before diving back to cripple the Asuryani jet bikes with shots from their haywire blasters and heat lancers. More stricken craft and mangled Hellion skyboards veered off every second, slamming into crystalline trees and ancient statuary, to explode in blossoming bursts of fire as the rest of the combatants raced on. Drazar's headlong flight was describing a vast figure of 8, an infinity sign that led straight back to the bonfire of the tribal summit. His intent was to finish what he had started, with the element of surprise his once more. But Yvain was no longer there. Ynnari had gone, and the webway portal was dwindling. Drazar pointed the way. His venom accelerated straight upwards into that shimmering gate, his Hellion and Scourge allies close behind. 2 Saim-Hann craft dived through after them, alongside Jain Zar's Falcon, and then the portal vanished entirely, sealed once more by Drazar's dark arts. Into the shadow. The Drukhari fled to Shadam, a ruined city populated only by phantoms and nightmarish memories. Yet there are some who brave its haunted reaches, those whose power is such they are offered no challenge even by blood-mad demons and creatures of shadow, and Drazar is amongst them. It was to the city of Shadam that Drazar made his escape from the failed assassination attempt upon Saim-Hann. He had lived there in a former life, and just as a tiger knows its lair, he knew its jagged, half-splintered landscape intimately. There he would take his blades to Jain Zar, attacking at a critical moment when the shadowy monstrosities that dwelt there working to ensure his victory. With the Phoenix Lord slain, there would be none to stand in his path when it was time to slay Vrain. More than that, the first of the Howling Banshees will be consigned to oblivion. Every Phoenix Lord has been slain many times over the millennia, but whenever an Eldari of sympathetic soul happens across their armor and answers the call of destiny to put it on, the Phoenix Lord lives once more. The soul of the present incumbent joins those of its predecessors in the gestalt that forms the psyche of the Eldari demigod. Drazar knew, however, that should the Phoenix Lord's armor lie still amongst the dust of a city so remote as Shadam, or better yet, be stolen away into the shadowy depths of Elindrach by his Mandrake allies, that Jain Zar will be defeated for time immemorial, and he will be free of her hunt. Jain Zar's pursuit of Drazar through the labyrinth dimension was long and arduous, and would have come to nothing were it not for the guidance of harlequins from the Mask of the Midnight Sorrow, sent by Eldred Othran to find Jain Zar in the folded skeins of the webway. The harlequins arrowed through spiraling tunnels and shattered spars, mounted upon Starweaver jet bikes, so they could match the speed of the Phoenix Lord's Saim-Hann allies. It took every ounce of the Harlequin's courage and cunning to keep Jain Zar's passage through the webway in focus, but they did not lose the psychic trail, and sure enough, they guided Jain Zar and her allies along the true path to their quarry. There were those amongst the Midnight Sorrow who suspected that Jain Zar had deliberately lingered a time to ensure their pursuers did not lose the scent entirely, but they were told in no uncertain terms to keep their peace. The dance of blades must occur, for Segara himself had foreseen it, and learned of that which would take place if the duel did not come to pass. After months of relentless pursuit, the Eldari emerged within Shadam. The duel between the Phoenix Lord and the Master of Blades was keenly anticipated by Asuryani and Harlequin alike, for only one of Jain Zar's speed and skill could hope to put down Jain Zar before his blades claimed Ivrain's head. But even the Harlequins of the Midnight Sorrow shied away from stepping through the runic portal that led to Shadam. When they reached the strange gate that led there, a twisted arc that pulsed as if made of living flesh, they turned back. They knew that the taint of chaos lay beyond, and would not risk its corruption. Jain Zar and her craft-world allies, made fast companions by the travails of their journey through the webway, entered Shadam with a mere dozen warriors between them. They could no longer maintain their high speeds here. The ruined city was so tangled and strange that only the most careful tracking would guide them to their quarry. Were it not for the acute senses of the Eldari and the accentuated psychic abilities that the Great Rift had brought forth in all their kind, the Howling Banshees may not have found the mind spore of their prey. But with the cold hatred of the Incubi cutting through the residual agony of the dead city, their rough location could be sensed upon the winds of the Psyche. With the care and stealth she had seen used by her brother Karandras, Jain Zar slunk through the alabaster ruins, her wrath and pent-up frustration ready to burst out in a hurricane of anger and violence as soon as she saw the black armor of the Incubi. It was amongst the overgrown, shardrak-swathed remnants of the Boulevard El Uriak that the Phoenix Lord met her match. It was dark there, supernaturally so, and even the heightened sense of the Eldari had difficulty piercing the gloom. The Incubi had made complex blood pacts with the mandrakes that haunted that region to keep them shrouded from sight, sunk beneath the skin of the labyrinth dimension in patches of living shadow. The Phoenix Lord and her acolytes prowled the ruined city, movement flickering on their peripheral vision, but never truly coming to light. Jain Zar and his kin awaited, as still as one of the great mantises native to Asur, until their prey wandered right into their lair. Bursting from the undergrowth came the Master of Blades. So swift was his attack that his demiclaves nearly took Jain Zar's head. A waterfall of hair fell from her grand plume as the power blaze whistled a fraction of an inch from her helm. Though Jain Zar was already within the reach of her clave, the Phoenix Lord's Triskel whipped up to catch the demiclaves on the backswing. With a twist of her wrist, she locked them, almost tearing them from Jain Zar's grip, and delivered a savage elbow to his throat. Suddenly, the two were engaged in a deadly grapple. Their blades were rendered awkward by sheer proximity, and neither was able to push away the other without risking a devastating blow in return. With her stylized helm all but kissing Jain Zar's impassive mask, Jain Zar gave vent to a deafening scream, so loud and mind-shatteringly powerful that the mandrakes clinging to the shadow were driven away in fear. The city was revealed in the lambent light of their absence, and the battle unfolding around them was thrown into sharp focus. Jain Zar's howling banshee allies had fared far worse. With the Incubi bursting from patches of darkness, they had found little chance to parry, nor employ their psychosonic amplifiers in time to stymie the Drukhari assault. The falcon and jet bikes that had accompanied them from Saim-Hann sent volleys of shuriken and laser fire to drive back the scourges and hellions descending from the spires. But two howling banshees had already been seized by the mandrakes that prowled the edges and had vanished without trace. Several more lay dead in the street, Their spirit stones had been prized from their chests with the tips of claves and ritual knives. For the incubi valued shattered spirit stones very highly, weaponizing them for the raw anguish they could emit when bound to the devices they called tormentors. It was just such a weapon that Drazar used to save himself from Jain Zar's looping blades. Bowled backwards by her washout, his fingers numbed by the psychosonic assault, the Master of Blades would have been slain but for his triggering of the tormentor device that hung around his neck. Not one, but a dozen shattered spirit stones gave vent to their immortal reservoirs of despair in a single devastating burst of psychic energy. Each stone had been torn from the breast of a howling banshee, some even from those slain upon Saim-Hann. The priceless soul gems had been deliberately collected from the corpses of her pupils, so the impact of their anguish would be all the more personal. Jain Zar staggered backwards, her psyche momentarily crippled by the tsunami of psychic pain from her daughter's spirits. She was not alone. Around her, the other Asuryani involved in the battle felt as if their souls had been wrenched from their bodies by cruel black claws of anguish. But the Drukhari feed on the suffering of others. The incubi closed in, grinning behind their masks as they killed the last of the howling banshees with an almost clinical efficiency. The Eldari of Saim-Hann withdrew, for they knew the day was lost. As his foes retreated, Drazar gathered his strength and pounced for the kill. A feint, a strike, and he cut the reeling Jain Zar in two at the waist. The halves of her bisected form toppled onto the dusty street. As her remains were dragged into the shadowy dimension by waiting mandrakes, lost to this reality and the next, a scream of hatred and denial rose up, the swan song of an Eldari legend. It did not go unnoticed. Slender Hopes. The death scream of the Phoenix Lord did not echo in the material realm. Jain Zar's remains were lost, taken to Dark Eldrinach by the evil shadow creatures Drazar called allies. There in the pitch darkness she was to be forgotten. But there was one soul who felt, rather than heard, her scream of wrath. The High Priestess of Ynnari, and made it safe from Saim-Hann due to the intervention of Jain Zar and her disciples. Passing through the ancient webway portal above the Craftworld's speaking place, she sought out a new Craftworld as the next part of her crusade. This was not a teeming, thriving world unto itself like Saim-Hann, but the distant wreckage of a Craftworld all but forgotten. Yet it existed still, and by way of the twisting capillaries of the webway, Yvain and her flock, several new adherents to the creed, from Saim-Hann amongst them, had sought it out. That Craftworld was known as Xandros, but it was not reached without incident. Deep in her nightly meditations on the nature of death, Yvain saw a vision of Jain Zar being pulled apart by shadowy claws. Something in her knew that it was no allegory, but the literal truth. She felt a terrible weight on her soul when she witnessed this. Upon distant Ulthway, Jain Zar had gone on record as a believer in the potential of Ynnari to change the fate of all Eldari, and she had altered her path accordingly. It was in Yvain's defense and that of the Ynnari creed that Jain Zar had given her life. But where there was the death of an Eldari soul, there too was Ynnari, waiting in repose on the other side. Opening her mind as she made to rest in the depths of the webway, Yvain prayed to the great morbid deity slumbering beneath the scions of possibility for the Phoenix Lord's deliverance. She drifted into a liminal state and had a sense of being lifted up. Her ears were filled with the thudding boom of a heartbeat made from the coalescence of trillions of dead Eldari. She felt examined, like a crystal before the lens of one of the path of the timeless observer. Then, just as the meteoric mote of power had surged from Kohira to slam into her in the arena of the Crucible, a glimmering burst of power shot out from her chest, disappearing into the hinterlands of consciousness, and from there into the deepest shadows of the void. The mote of new consciousness came to rest not in Jain Zar's bodily remains, for they had been devoured by the hungry shade beasts of Alendrach. Instead, it pierced the torn corpse of one of the howling banshees who had been captured and dragged into the abyssal darkness by lurking mandrakes during the battle of the Shadam. Scavenger things screeched and fell back. Had they possessed eyes, they would have been blinded in that moment by the brightness of divine energy. The aspect warrior known as Exarch Quintui Ynnari. She got up unsteadily as the energies of resurrection flowed through her, then righted herself and stood tall. Prowling shadow things slunk from the corners of their lairs, curious as to the movement of one they had assumed to be dead. Exarch Quintui Yen picked up her blades and in a sudden whirl cut the shadow creatures down. She strode to the blood-stained armor plates of Jain Zar, arranged in a sick mockery of their proper arrangement over the skeleton of a captured ogrin, and with great reverence began to remove them from sordid display. As she took down the mask, she felt a gestalt soul calling to her, and placed it upon her face. In that moment she sealed her fate, and gave Jain Zar new life. The soul of Quintui Yen melded with those who had existed within Jain Zar's composite animus for so many millennia. Her spirit was reignited, not only by the might and white-hot rage of Cain, but also by the slow-burning, sustaining black fire of Ynnari. The slaughter of Alendrach's crawling, hissing creatures was great. Oceans of black blood and shadowy ichor spattered the black arches and walls of that hidden reality. It did not sate the murderous lust in the newborn Phoenix Lord's heart. After pausing to take the spirit stones of her fallen daughters into safekeeping, she made straight for a portal she could sense deep in the maze-like passageways through the chamber, scything down anything foolish enough to stand in her way. With innumerable bodies lying in her wake, she at last stood before the runic gateway sealed in ages past and long forgotten. With a shout of psychic force so powerful, it liquefied the minds of those mandrakes crawling towards her. She activated it for the first time in eons. Glowing Eldari runes appeared in the darkness. She passed through, not to the webware she had expected, but to the craft world of Xandros. Xandros was a craft world lost to the annals of history, but had once been a mighty jewel in the crown of the Eldari race. Its spiraling towers were tall and proud, and when the Felix Lords had been but mortals, it had been known for its artisanry and mastery of esoteric weaponry. Tragically, it had been too close to the Eye of Terror at the time of the fall. Racked by psychic shockwaves, its people were transformed into soulless husks, and its psychoplastic structures shattered beyond any sane hope of regrowth. Only those who had ventured far from the craft world at the time of Slaanesh apotheosis survived, and of them little to no evidence could be found. The site had meaning nonetheless, as did any integral part of the ancient Eldari Empire. Yvraine, in her quest for the 5 legendary blades known as the Crone Swords, 4 of which were already in the Ynnari's possession, had ventured via the hidden path of the Harlequins to the outskirts of Xandros. It was her hope that the lost craft world would contain a portal to the ancient Eldari relic world of Belial IV, where she believed clues to the location of the last Crone Sword could be found. With Xandros as her base of operations, she intended to raid Belial IV once more and return to real space triumphant, or so she maintained to her followers. She suspected there were double agents in the flocks of the Ynnari, and that Drazar would find her, no matter where she travelled. All she could do was stack the deck against the Master of Blades and hope that when he finally struck, he would fail in his assassination attempt. In this, the gods of fate smiled upon her. Even as she and her escort of Saim-Hann acolytes made her way to the central plaza of Xandros, her ally Jain Zar was emerging from the portal that led to forgotten Aldernach. The reunion was emotional. Ynnari, setting themselves against the spiritual forces that caused the Asuryani to shield them. Even their identities behind restrictive facades had taken off their masks in a gesture of defiance to Slaanesh. They would hide no more, fear no more. Jain Zar did not follow suit, for she was the armor and the armor was her. She could no more remove her mask than one of the mortal Eldari could remove his face. Instead, she tied a crimson band around her upper arm in the manner of the new faith, a clear symbol of her allegiance to Ynnari as well as Cain. Though the two legendary warriors did not join in an embrace, their psyches flared with such intensity that many a tear was shed amongst the Ynnari. Perhaps they would conquer their demons yet, and in the meantime, see the hopes of the Dark Muse Vect and his cat's paw Drazar dashed to nothing on the ancient flagstones of Xandros. From death, new faith. The loss of Jain Zar could have dealt a mortal blow to the hopes of Ynnari, for it presaged the death of Yvraine as well. But hope had been reborn upon Xandros, the most remote of craft worlds, and the site of another dark nemesis's demise in the ancient history of the Eldari race. It was on Xandros that Jain Zar and Drazar met in combat once more, for the Master of Blades would rather take his own life than abandon his hunt, and his temple had sown agents of their own through the nomadic congregation of the Ynnari. A report had reached the Master Incubus of the Phoenix Lord's escape from Eldernech. His allies amongst the Mandrakes had got word to the Scourges in Vect's employ, and they had in turn borne it to Drazar. The Master of Blades had journeyed to Xandros via the same shadowy pathways as Jain Zar. Of all the living Eldari left in the galaxy, he was one of the few that remembered the craft world from its resplendent past. He made haste to the ruins of that ancient world ship, his fellow mercenaries in tow. There, after 6 days of tireless searching amongst the broken glories of the once great craft world, he saw the scattered figures of the Ynnari sharing council in the plaza of the Pantheon United. Yvraine had chosen Xandros as the site of the final showdown for a reason. She knew her Asuryani myths well, and had learned during her time as an aspect warrior that the Phoenix Lord Karandras had duelled Ahra, the father of scorpions, for 17 days across his tumbled landscapes. There were rumours amongst the Eldari cognoscenti that Drazar was a pupil of Ahra's from ages past. Some even believed they were one and the same. To stage the final clash on the site of such a legendary defeat would be to gain a morale advantage that could tip the balance. It was the dead of night when Drazar came for Jain Zar. Under her explicit orders, the Master of Blades was allowed to stride through the craft world without interception. She had a debt of revenge to repay, and any who chose to intercept him were likely signing their own death warrants. This was a vendetta between the Howling Banshees, the Saim-Hann Eldari, and the Drukhari mercenaries, and it would be settled in blood. Drazar sprinted straight for Jain Zar, a black blur among the shattered spiral pillars and toppled statuary. He leapt for the kill. Their blades clashed with a ring that echoed across the landscape. The ring turned it to a chiming chorus, a clangor of battle that filled the streets. All around, Howling Banshees and Incubi joined in combat. On the periphery, Scourges, Hellions and other Drukhari mercenaries were engaged by skirmishing Saim-Hann forces, but they did not intervene. Though they may have been bitter enemies, they were Eldari, and they respected the myth unfolding before them. At first it seemed that Jain Zar might be overmatched. She was fighting not to strike, not to end the duel, but to defend. Attacking in an onslaught of blades, Drazar had gained an early advantage and kept the pressure on ever since. Those amongst the Howling Banshees that watched Jain Zar fight realized she was conserving her strength, playing a game of patience, wisdom, rather than outright fury. While she knew that the weeks-long duel of Karandras was not within her power, this time it did not need to be. Asuryani and Drukhari mercenary alike began to fall. Jain Zar fought faster and faster. Yvraine's concentration was bent upon her and her alone, for the Vizark's expert blademanship kept the killing thrusts of the Drukhari from harming the Daughter of Shades. The spiritual link between Yvain and Jain Zar was strong, and the power of Ynnari manifested through that connection. The incubi fought with every vicious trick and merciless assault they could muster, knowing that to kill was to take sustenance from the dead. The same was true of those hellions and scourges still in the fight, though many of their number lay slain in the dust. Those that fought on were invigorated by suffering to the point they practically glowed with stolen energy. They were not alone. The more they killed, the more those who had converted to the Ynnari cause became revitalized by the energies of death, and the Felix Lord was amongst them. Jarzar's surety, his lethal confidence started to falter as he realized his opponent was fighting faster than even he. Then, just as the sun began to set, Jain Zar disarmed him with one of his demiclaves, sending the blades spinning away. There was a moment, a fraction of a second, where the two met each other's gaze, and in that sliver of time, the truth of the duel became clear. As Ynnari, as a warrior of Ynnari as well as Cain, Jain Zar was drawing strength from the death that was filling the streets. The soul stuff of dead Eldari was giving her a new wellspring of power, letting fly a triumphant shriek that cracked the wraithbone around her with its volume. Jain Zar brought her blade up in a scooping motion and impaled Jarzar, lifting him high before cutting his head from his body with her triskel. That cry of victory sent the incubi reeling. The howling banshees cut them down one after another, even as the Saim-Hann Eldari hunted their Drukhari foes to the death. Jarzar lay dead. The Ynnari were triumphant, and the legend of a fallen Phoenix Lord had been written in blood. The aftermath of the Asuryani victory saw the Ynnari leaving Xandros for the Webway once more. Yvain revealed to her closest advisors the truth of their removal to Xandros. They shared her suspicion that several of the Drukhari had joined the Ynnari in name only, and that she could not evade her pursuers indefinitely. Resolving herself to the inevitable conflict, she had chosen her battlefield and her champion well. None other than Jain Zar could have brought Jarzar out into the open, and hoped to match him in single combat as ritual demanded. She strode to Jain Zar's side as they withdrew from Xandros, maintaining that together they were free to lead the Ynnari into a new era of unity and progress. Jain Zar bowed her head and said nothing. The next morning she was gone, a single red ribbon, all she left behind. Epilogue. Darakenia Thromens wandered in a daze across the shattered mosaic of Los Xandros. Around her the elegant spiralling towers rose high, the same bone hue as the armour of those howling banshee corpses that lay scattered over the battle site. They had been picked clean by some manner of scavenger, tough enough to survive even Xandros' demise. As Darakenia stared fascinated at one of the skeletal cadavers, a crystalline centipede scurried from its eye socket and skittered into the dust. Here was only death, carrion, and unquiet ghosts. It was the remains of the Eldari Empire in microcosm, rendered as a parable that any fool could read. Darakenia and her fellow incubi felt little in the way of regret for the events of the fall. Only the strongest could be allowed to thrive. It was an immutable law of nature and a central tenet of the incubi creed. What need had she to weigh down her blade with guilt, with angst, with crippling doubt? No, she was a Clayvex, and she knew not these things. She had forgotten them, left them long behind. But sometimes, and today was one of those times, she felt like perhaps she had lost something in the process, just as she had lost the rest of her shrine. Then she saw it, segmented armor black and bladed, and a featureless white helm. She approached the horned mast and picked it up to look through its eyes. She had always been curious. The Clayvex gathered the armor, detached her own armor plates hook by hook, and donned the mask. It was the last thing that Darakenia Thromens ever did. End quote. And thus, gentle listener, we have witnessed the death of a Phoenix Lord, the resurrection of a Phoenix Lord, the destruction of Drazar, who may be Ahra, and then, of course, the proof of it. As that incubi picked up his mask and put it on, it was the last thing she did, meaning that Drazar is a Phoenix Lord. He is in fact Ahra, and that armor will allow Drazar to return to plague the Ynnari and all of the galaxy again. And the question now is, has his death meant the fulfillment of his contract through failure, or will he come back at Yvraine again? And will Asdrubal Vecht stop in his quest for her destruction, the destruction of Yvraine, emissary of Ynyad? Or will he just take other options now that his first hand has seemed incomplete, has failed? Woe to Yvraine, for in all of the galaxy, one could not have a worse enemy than Asdrubal Vecht. Speaking of which, I think it is high time that we had a good look at Asdrubal Vecht. Hopefully next week, maybe. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. If you have enjoyed my rendition of the Blood of the Phoenix, then please do consider liking and subscribing. And if you are a regular viewer and see worth in what I am doing, then please do consider also supporting us on Patreon. More content will be coming very, very soon. Oh, we're also on Facebook and on Twitter, so sling me a message. Toodaloo.